Welcome to Advanced Fundamentals Lab Caddy Project Assembly Video 1. So what I have here before me are pieces 1, 2, and 3. They are all cut out, but now we're ready to begin assembly. And I want to point out that on these pieces, we've got lines that we drew. So we've got lines for pocket marks, which I also transferred to the wrong side of my fabric. On pieces 2 and 3, there are also stitch lines right down the middle, which have also been transferred onto the wrong side of my fabric. Now we need these lines for assembly, but they're on the wrong side and we need to see them from the right side. So what we're going to do is we are going to machine thread trace these lines. So for pieces 2 and 3, which are two different pockets, we're going to machine thread trace just right across this line on both pieces, on piece number 2 and on pieces number 3. We're going to machine thread trace right across there. Okay, I will show you that in a moment. Now, for the front and back pieces, our cutting instructions were cut 2 of fashion fabric and cut 2 of lining. These pockets are not going on the lining. They're just going on the fashion fabric. So we actually do not need 2 of these pieces. So I'm going to take 2 of these pieces away, and I'm left with 2 other pieces. Now on these 2 other pieces, we're going to machine thread trace these lines that are the pocket placement lines. All right, let's head over to the machine to thread trace. We are now going to thread trace these lines so that we can see them on the correct side of the fabric. Real quick, before you begin sewing, we need to, since this is just machine thread tracing, we're going to change our stitch length to the largest setting that your machine can do. It's just a basting stitch. We don't need this line to actually do anything other than show us where we need to sew. Because we're machine basting, we are not going to backstitch, and I'm going to start right here on the corner and go all the way down. Find my foot. And I'm stopping right at the edge lock mark here. Machine thread trace. So now you've got the line on the wrong side of the fabric is now also visible on the right side of the fabric. Now for the purpose of this video, I am using a contrasting thread so that you can more easily see each step. But for your project, it is up to you whether or not you want to use a contrasting thread or a matching thread. If you want a nice clean look, I would recommend doing a matching thread. So I'm going to thread trace the other pocket placement line. Again, I am stopping right at the edge of my stitch line because I don't need my thread tracing to go beyond that. And now both of these lines have been machine thread traced. We can see them on the right side as well as the wrong side. I would also go ahead and trim your threads down because we don't need all of that extra stringy thread. So that was piece number 1, and I'm only doing that to the fashion fabric pieces, not the lining fabric pieces. Here is piece number 3. This is a pocket. I'm going to just do the same thing right on that center line. That is our stitch line. Now, if you so choose, you can totally do all of this by hand, but machine thread tracing for this project is fine, and it is also faster. Just make sure you're using a basting stitch length. And I just lost my thread, came out of the needle. Okay, now that my needle is rethreaded, I'm going to continue thread tracing this line on pocket piece number 2. Okay, so now we've got this thread tracing on our pocket pieces as well as the front and the back just of the main fabric. Here it got really weird and wonky. That's okay. I will pull this out and redo it, and we will move on. Now the next step on our pockets is to roll hem the top edge of our pockets. So I've got my whole stack of 2 of my number 2 pieces and 2 of my number 3 pieces. We've got our stitch line down the middle that is going vertically to me. That makes this the top edge. So a rolled hem is a hem that is folded over twice like this and is usually pretty small. So here's how we want to do that. Scoot this in closer so you can see. I am going to take the edge of the fabric and fold it to the stitch line right here. I'm going to do this a small piece at a time, and I'm going to press it as I go. So I'm folding the edge of the fabric to my stitch line, and I am pressing it. Hitting this with a fair amount of steam to get it to stay in place. So that's one fold, and the next is I need to fold this again the same amount as what's folded here, because this stitch line needs to be the very top edge because all of this gets folded into the seam allowance. So I've got the seam allowance folded in half. If I fold it again like this, that gives me the full seam allowance amount right on the edge. So I'm going to put my nails right there at the edge of my fabric, fold it there so that it is as even as I can make it, and it is nice and straight. Hit this with a fair amount of steam for my fabric because it wants to roll out. And I'm going to, just for the sake of my fabric, since it's being a little, wants to unroll on me, I'm going to flip this to the right side and press it again. Okay. So we need to complete that step with every piece. Just on one long top edge, you're going to fold the edge over to the stitch line, press it, fold that again, so the stitch line is right here at the fold. My stitch line is right here where it's folded. Do that with both number 2 pieces and both number 3 pieces. Rolled edge, top on one side. If you are having trouble doing this rolled hem, I want to show you one trick that you can use. You'll need your pins, and you'll need to be using the ironing table that is pinnable. These pins can go straight into the board. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to roll this edge the first time, and then I'm going to pin it with my pin going sideways, kind of into the fabric of the table. The reason that I am pinning this sideways is so that when I go to iron, I'm not going over my pins, especially my pin heads. These pins that have the colored tops, sometimes they're made of glass, sometimes they're made of plastic, but you don't know unless you get them hot. So let's just avoid that altogether. So I've used my pins to roll this whole hem down so that now I don't have to hold it with my fingers as I press. Now I'm going to pull my pins out as I go because it is preferable not to iron over your pins at all. But because my pins were there, that helped hold that edge in place so I could just iron. Now I can do that again. So I'm going to roll this edge again. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to push my pins at an angle so they're not in the way of the iron as I go to iron, and they're easier to pull out. I'm just sticking my pins in right here at the edge of the turn, so not up here on this side. Just add an angle into the table. And now I can press it. And I pull my pins out as I go. That makes it really fast and easy to press that hem and save your fingers from the heat of the iron. Again, you can do this either way. You can use the pins, you can do it by hand. Just be careful that you don't burn your fingers. Now, the next step on the rolled hem is we need to stitch this rolled hem down. I'm going to sew from the wrong side so that I can see my edge here, and I want to stitch very close to this edge of the rolled hem. Now remember, the last stitch we did was a machine basting stitch, so our stitch length is still set really high. We need to turn that back down to a 3. I'm going to put this in the machine. I did go ahead, before I brought these to the machine, I went ahead and put pins in all of my edges. so that everything is nice and pinned. It's a good idea to always pin. I am back stitching as I go, and I'm just sewing right there close to the edge. I'm kind of running the edge of my fold right here with this inside edge of my presser foot, right there. That catches all of these folded layers. Back stitch at the end. And now this edge is completely folded. All of those raw edges are tucked to the inside. Repeat those steps for the rest of the pocket pieces, the number 2s and number 3s that you folded. The next steps for our pockets is to serge along the bottom edge. So the rolled hem is our top edge. This is our bottom edge. Now, if you've never used a serger before, what it does is it creates an overlocking stitch like this. And using a serger is really simple. You just have to be careful with it because right here there is a knife edge that will cut off the edge of the fabric. For our pattern pieces, we do not want to cut off any excess fabric. So you'll line your fabric up with this edge right here to prevent the knife from cutting anything off. Now right here in the back is the lever for the presser foot. I'm going to lift that up and slide my sample fabric in and line it up with this edge. Remember to always put your presser foot back down. Sergers will get very angry if you don't. So all I'm going to do is just sew right ahead with my serger. So what it's doing now is it's creating this overlocking stitch, like on this side. But I want to show you what the knife can do before you actually begin doing it on your pieces. If you've never used a serger before, I highly recommend grabbing a scrap piece of fabric and testing out how to use it so that you're comfortable before you do it on your pattern pieces. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pull my fabric to the right, and you'll see the serger cut off extra fabric. This is what we don't want to do. Also, when you get to the end of your serging row, you need to continue serging and sewing so that you have a very long tail coming off the back end, or the serger will become unthreaded, and it is very difficult to rethread. So that is how you use a serger. Once you feel comfortable, then take your pocket pieces, pieces number 2 and 3, and just serge along the bottom edge opposite the rolled hem you did. And all I'm doing is stitching right here close to the edge. I'm not letting the knife cut off any excess. Just like that. Repeat that with all 4 pocket pieces, and then we'll move on to the next step. The next step is to begin putting the pocket pieces onto the main front and back pieces. We want to do this with right sides together. So the edge that has all of the markings on it is the wrong side for my fabric. I flip this right side up, and this is the right side here. So right sides are together. Now what I want to do is I want to line this stitch line, which is the bottom stitch line near my serging, with this top line here, because this is the pocket 2 placement line. Now, if you notice, while I'm lining this up, my rolled hem edge is actually towards the bottom. This is upside down. That is what we want, because what we're going to do is we're going to stitch along this line and then fold our pocket up, press, and stitch again. So your pocket needs to be, the rolled hem needs to be facing towards the bottom of the front back piece. Okay, so I'm going to grab my pins, and we are going to match this stitch line with this basting line. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to visually kind of line it up as best I can. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my pin, I'm going to poke it into the corner here, fold my fabric back, and find my stitch line and pin through that layer as well. I'm going to go down and back up right on top of that line. And as I'm doing this, I'm going to flip it over and check and make sure that my pin is matching up with this thread traced line. And I'm going to do that all the way down. So I'm just kind of visually checking as I go down and up right on that line. And again, I'm going to check and make sure it's all lined up like it's supposed to be. We're going to do this all the way down. This is pocket piece 2 that we are attaching to the main body. If you are unsure of which of your lines on the main body are your pocket placement line for each pocket, what you can do is you can take your pattern piece and see the top line is pocket piece number 2. Pocket piece number 3 is on the bottom. Okay, so I didn't get this last one very straight, so I need to fix this one. There we go. Okay, so now this is all nice and lined up with my stitch line, and I'm going to repeat with the other piece. I'm going to show you this so that you can see it more than once. Right side up, right side together. I'm going to visually line up my stitch line first, and then start pinning and double check as I go to make sure that these lines are perfectly matched up. Use as few or as many pins as you need for this process to make sure that they are nice and lined up. As you sew this together, you will remove your pins, and I'll show you that in the next clip. All right, so this is all pinned together. Now we're ready to take them to the sewing machine. Now I am ready to begin stitching right on top of this stitch line. I'm going to start here near the edge. I'm going to back stitch and remove my pins as I go. I'm just stitching right on top of that line. For this, I went ahead and went all the way through the seam allowance to the edge. That makes flipping it a little easier. So now you can see, now that it's stitched together, it's really easy for me to flip this pocket edge up, and we've got a nice clean line here at the bottom. We'll take this to the iron in just a moment. Now I've stitched both of my pockets on. I want to take this pocket and push it up towards the top. You can see a little bit of my thread tracing line here. I didn't get my line perfectly straight, which is fine because this is a basting thread, so it's going to be really easy to pull out when I'm ready for that step. So I'm pushing my pocket up and then pressing this edge here at the bottom so that we have a nice, clean, flat edge. Now I'm going to take my pins, pin the edges together, because in a moment I'm going to take this back to the machine and baste these edges together within the seam allowance. Okay, that's one piece done. Now let's do this to the other one. Going to gently smooth this edge straight and up. Make sure my pocket is straight at the top. And press this edge well. And pin my seam allowance together. Now, what I need to do next is I'm going to baste these edges together within the seam allowance. So I'm going to change my stitch length up. And all I'm going to do is I'm actually going to sew from the bottom to the top. And I'm going to sew within the seam allowance. From the edge of our sewing machine presser feet to the needle, when the needle is at center, is 1/4 of an inch. And that is well within my seam allowance. So I'm just going to run the edge of my fabric right along the edge of my presser foot. Take my pin out as I go. And you don't have to backstitch. You can also sew from the wrong side so you can see your seam allowance width and just sew within that. Whatever is comfortable for you. So that's basted together. And I'm going to repeat that with the other piece. Now that I have my pocket seam allowances basted together, the next step is I need to stitch through this machine basted line. So I'm going to change my stitch length back to a regular stitch length. And I just had my needle come unthreaded. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to top stitch right on top of this machine basting line. I'm going to start right here up at the top. I'm going to make sure that I back stitch over that rolled hem and carefully stitch just right on top of that machine basted line, back stitching at the bottom. Trim my threads. And now I have two separating pockets right here. Repeat with the other piece. Once you have top stitched down that center thread trace line, the next thing we need to do is top stitch along the bottom edge of the seam. We want to stitch 1/4 of an inch away from this bottom edge. Like I said before, the distance from the edge of our presser foot to the needle on these machines when the needle is at center is 1/4 of an inch. So all I have to do is just line up the edge of my presser foot with the edge of this seam. We're using a regular stitch length, and I am back stitching at the beginning and the end. This reinforces the bottom edge of the pocket to give it extra strength. Now our top pocket is complete. We're ready to do the next pocket. For pocket number 3, we are basically going to follow all of the exact same steps, but our placement line is the one here on the bottom. So I'm going to do the same thing as before. And real quick, we're going to do a little montage to skip through this so that you can see how this goes together, because it is basically the same steps as the pocket number 2. Now, one thing I'm doing as I am folding the second pocket edge up is I am lining up my thread tracing with the thread tracing on the pocket above to make it look a little nicer.